and the statistics that you've just mentioned, 18% of the world's population. I think good to also note that youngest continent, median age 19 years actually. Wow. And out of that, 60% are below 25 years. That's potential. Two, I think if you look at the resources, just the natural resources, that Africa is endowed with resources. Madagascar, for example, produces 80%, 80, of the world's vanilla production.
One thing also that I want to expand on, Africa, and me being an African as well, we don't focus much on manufacturing. We focus on moving our perishables. Africa's known for their agricultural, we all know this. But when are we going to put our raw materials together and start manufacturing and refining our own gold and working on being an export hub like the Far East, starting to produce? You talk about e-commerce.
Last year, Hong Kong International Airport handled 4.9 million tons of cargo, a year-on-year growth of 14%. So that's, I just want to set the scene.
Kenya Airways is one of the best connected airlines within the continent. One of the big issues around Africa is really connectivity. And talking about connectivity, there are two paradigms to this. For you to have cheap, direct products, you need the infrastructure. We're coming from a dispensation where there were very few African operators, national airlines within Africa.
What we would call pathway programs to getting young people in to see what a rewarding career cargo and logistics can be is very important. I would say, in short, conflict and political instability are major drivers to a lack of trade. This goes back to what I'll call the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're familiar with that.
When you look at GDP growth, you see that 9 of the world's 20 fastest growing economies are actually in Africa today, right? That includes Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, just to name a few. And you look at the forecast for these countries, and they're also expected to be among the fastest growing in the next 5 or 10 years.
I think couldn't ask for a better panel. I mean, really a great lineup of experts. And we hope the next 6 hours and 15 minutes will be really great discussion. Please feel free to ask questions. I've got 38 pages worth of questions, but if we run out, please, we look to you guys to actually fill in some of the blanks. Let me just give a couple of comments. You know, we've already had a great opening session this morning with the opening ceremony, but just a few things that really I think we need to reiterate about this great continent. 18% of the global population, I think it's somewhere in the region of about 20% of global land mass, but when it comes to air cargo or aviation, it's about only 2%. So that's one of the things will obviously be coming up in the discussions. But air cargo demand here is growing. Again, we need to hear from the experts about why, where, and how, and what we can do to capture that. We know that going forward, there's a great deal of focus on expanding trade, e-commerce, industrialization across the continent. But a lot of these topics are the same sort of topics that we've heard about for many years, so it'd be great to get their feedback as to how we can finally kind of address these. And just lastly, I'd like to do a couple of numbers. We know last year for the global air cargo industry was an excellent year, finished with about, and I'm going to quote some of the IATA numbers here, finished with about 11% growth year over year, with capacity growing by about 7%. When it comes to Africa, Africa grew by about 8.5% last year in actual tonnage, but interestingly, it was the only region where capacity actually grew more than the actual market. Capacity out of Africa grew by 13%. So overall, there was even more opportunity for expansion. And perhaps we can talk a little bit about why the capacity grew. Was it a lot of returning passenger traffic? Was it freighters? be interesting to get the comments of this group. So I'm going to start with a general question for everybody, and I'm going to do this. Actually, I'm going to start ladies first. So I'll start with Racheal, and then we'll work through. So, you know, we've talked about the fact that the air cargo industry is there predominantly to support international trade. So for our industry to grow, we actually need trade to grow. Focusing on this region, we need to say, well, why is African trade so low with the outside world? We've all been to many conferences over the last few years, and as I say, we often talk about the similar topics. And we quite often hear, well, there's challenges with infrastructure, there's issues with trade and tariffs, there's political instability, lack of diversified economies, a vast proliferation of countries with over 55 countries in the continent, dependence on external markets, etc., etc. Also talk about a lack of information and awareness and, from the grassroots. So focusing on trade, so my question to you, each of you, and as I say, starting with you, Racheal, is why is African trade so low, and what needs to take place to really expand upon this? We've got the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, we've got challenges, not allowed to mention a man with orange skin and yellowy hair or something, that he hasn't yet said that Africa is going to become the 52nd state, but apologies if that's a politically inappropriate thing to say. There will be a few inappropriate things that will come up. I do apologize in advance. But Racheal, we know that the world is a great interactive array of integrated economies. So how can we grow African trade?
Thank you. I think when you talk about Africa and the statistics that you've just mentioned, 18% of the world's population, I think good to also note that youngest continent, median age 19 years actually. Wow. And out of that, 60% are below 25 years. That's potential. Two, I think if you look at the resources, just the natural resources, that Africa is endowed with resources. Madagascar, for example, produces 80%, 80% of the world's vanilla production. And that's just an example. Then your question is, then why? And these conversations, we're aware of these conversations, we come for conferences, and the still question remains why. Just from my side, one of the contributing factors is that we don't have, or we're not exploiting our resources. All we need is have a unified market. Put all these resources, the human resource, the natural resources, and exploit that. And indeed, the solutions are known. We know the solutions. We have all the organizations, as you've mentioned, but we're not yet there. So it's just actualizing these solutions, these homegrown solutions. How do we get a unified market? And once we do that and really walk through that, that whole exploit the fact that we can. I think one of the biggest issues is the fragmentation brings in all these barriers of trade. How do we make it easy for us within this continent to trade, not just within Africa, but with the rest of the world?
Excellent, Racheal, and I hope the politicians hear that, because as you say, we really as a continent need to exploit the natural resources and the youth. And just a reflection of the youth, every time I come here, it's not just the youngest continent, it's the most polite. Everywhere I go, they say, "Excuse me, old man, would you like my chair? Can I open the door for you?" So I feel older in this continent than anywhere else in the world. So thank you for having such a young population. So, Grant, what's your thoughts? We've heard about natural resources, the youth, the energy. What do you think about African trade?
All right, there we go.
There we go.
1, 2, 1, 2. Look, I've always found the basis of logistics. None of us have have left school or grown up and said, hey, you want to work in logistics. We've all wanted to be something else. We fall into this industry. And that's the fact. The fact is we don't provide enough to the young generation to say, without logistics globally, the world falls apart. And we experienced that through COVID. And that's one thing I would like to highlight into the future. And I've been bringing it up in the UAE, getting the university kids. And I was presenting the other day, just 2 weeks ago, to a kindergarten school, and they didn't actually believe that things flew underneath the plane. So making people understand how logistics works and motivating kids and children to get involved is where the requirement is. One thing also that I want to expand on, Africa, and me being an African as well, we don't focus much on manufacturing. We focus on moving our perishables. Africa's known for their agricultural, we all know this. But when are we going to put our raw materials together and start manufacturing and refining our own gold and working on being an export hub like the Far East, starting to produce? You talk about e-commerce. I mean, it's a growing tendency from the east to the west, but it hasn't really snatched up here in Africa. We don't touch e-commerce, and we're a bigger portion of the population globally compared to Europe and America. We should be the ones producing and manufacturing and sending that. We are the middle of the globe. And that's where I draw the line, is we need to start focusing on manufacturing and focusing on making it aware to the younger generation that there is a potential for job opportunities within logistics. You don't fall into it nowadays. There must be ambition.
Excellent, I like that. It's actually continuing what Racheal was saying. So we've got these great natural resources, but instead of exporting the natural resources, keep them, add value here, and then use the great logistics network to move that. Great, excellent. Wilson, coming to you and your thoughts about trade here and what can we do?
Sure. You can all hear me, right? So first of all, good morning and thanks, Glyn, and thanks to the organizer for inviting us. So I'm from Hong Kong Air Cargo Terminals Limited. For those of you who do not know us that well, a very quick introduction of what we do. We are the ground handler in Hong Kong. We own and operate Super Terminal 1, which is one of the cargo terminals in Hong Kong. Last year, Hong Kong International Airport handled 4.9 million tons of cargo, a year-on-year growth of 14%. So that's, I just want to set the scene. Now, Hong Kong has been successful because of several reasons. One is, of course, the manufacturing footprint in southern China. Secondly, we have got a great and business facilitating customs regime. We also have professional and committed people. Now, why do I mention that? Because these are all relevant factors for any jurisdictions which wants to look at how to grow the air cargo industry. And so it is not just applicable to Hong Kong. This is a universal formula. So we already heard that there is a great demographic dividend in the continent. We already heard that there is huge resources available, whether for extraction, for processing, and thereafter for export. And you know, there is a commitment as well. I think what can actually take it to the next level is to stay focused and to how to turn this commitment to the next level by working together as a continent, whether it's through taking down trade barriers, whether it is putting together all the manufacturing footprints, and then it is how to ensure that the export grows. Because in Hong Kong, it is predominantly an export-focused airport. And I think, you know, for us, we would love to have more import coming from the African continent. A lot of the fresh products and of course the flowers, which we have just seen transported for Valentine's Day, are from the continent. So I think, you know, there is definitely a huge potential for the continent and for the air cargo to soar.
Excellent, thank you, Wilson. I think that's another aspect, which is, you know, African trade, for it to grow, can actually just replicate what others have done. It doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. It just has to say, if it worked there, we can make it work here. So Peter, coming back, your continent, proud. how can we grow African trade?
Yeah, thank you, Glyn. Kenya Airways is one of the best connected airlines within the continent. One of the big issues around Africa is really connectivity. And talking about connectivity, there are two paradigms to this. For you to have cheap, direct products, you need the infrastructure. We're coming from a dispensation where there were very few African operators, national airlines within Africa. I think you could potentially mention less than 10 over the last couple of years. One very good thing that's happening in Africa is that there is a resurgence of African carriers. I'm not going to mention brands, but over the last 3 years, I could mention about 7 airlines that are reviving, 7 countries that are reviving their national airlines. And besides reviving these airlines, they're bringing in robust capacity. What this does is that it improves the connectivity within the continent. It's 3.5 hours flying from Nairobi to Kinshasa. But flowers going to Kinshasa will have to go all the way to Europe. That's about 8 hours. And then another 6-7 hours to Kinshasa. That's about 15 hours. With an opportunity to do a 3.5 hour connection. So I would say connectivity has been a big issue that's been limiting intra-Africa trade. Let me also highlight, while we are having a resurgence of African carriers, Africa is also running into a geopolitical constraint. The airspace within the continent, you literally have to do, Hactl jumps. We are having a political crisis in the Sudan. We are having political crisis around a number of countries in West Africa. So a Kenya Airways flight going into Europe has to use a very elongated corridor into different parts of the continent. And this in itself increases a lot of the costs for the consumer. So I would really say those are really 2 big issues which front and center need to be addressed. Connectivity and resolution around the geopolitical crisis.
Excellent. And I have to say, these answers are not coordinated, but they're really building a great picture because, as you say, we can manufacture great things, but if the connectivity is not there, and your example of flying flowers 15 hours for potentially a 3-hour market, and I believe cocoa beans out of Ghana into Nigeria, which should be like a 45-minute to an hour's flight, is taking just as long. Crazy examples, but excellent. Thank you for that. So, Eric, moving on to you next. What's your thoughts? I mean, you travel the world, you see an awful lot. What is it about this market that can enhance the trade development?
Well, thanks, Glenn. And on behalf of Qatar Airways Cargo, we're delighted to be back in Nairobi after 14 years. It's such a wonderful market. We've gotten such a warm welcome. I hope the conference continues to be a great success over the next 2 or 3 days, and we would welcome the opportunity to have the conference hosted here again in the future. I think, in short, I like what my colleague Racheal and in particular Grant have already said. I do believe that what we would call pathway programs to getting young people in to see what a rewarding career cargo and logistics can be is very important. I would say, in short, conflict and political instability are major drivers to a lack of trade. This goes back to what I'll call the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're familiar with that. People need to feel secure and stable in order to grow. And you can't have economic growth without security and stability. So until you eliminate conflict and you eliminate political instability, you won't have commercial growth. And so that's the only thing that commerce dislikes most. Other than that, it's over-regulation. You can't have regulation until you have stability and political lack of conflict. And we don't see that right now on the continent, as Peter has already mentioned. But I mean, apart from that, I would like to say we're rather bullish on the market in Africa. I mean, we have 28 markets that we serve here, plus 4 with just freighters alone. It's a growing market. I mean, I read a statistic in preparation for the conference this week that said by this year, at the end of 2025, e-commerce alone is expected to be a $40 billion market across the continent, growing at almost 9%. So, I mean, those are huge numbers. Any economy would welcome that type of growth for this particular sector. And I think, we're prepared to take advantage of that. I think things are going to continue to grow. We're rather happy with the development and the growth here. Could it be faster? Sure. But I would also say that aspirationally, we always want things to be better, faster, more. But I also want to say we've all done a good job, frankly, in this business and bringing things up to where it was. I arrived in Kenya for the first time this morning at 1 in the morning, and I came down a fantastic expressway. I was greeted warmly. I think there's a lot going for Nairobi and for Kenya in general, and we're very supportive of the market and can't wait to see where it goes.
Excellent, thank you. And again, with such a young population, I'm sure e-commerce is going to come up quite a few times in our discussion. But just when you talk about political stability, I mean, there's 30% of the global sovereign states are based here in Africa. That in itself brings one of the challenges for SATAM, the single air transport market. Anyway, so coming to you, Aaron, what's your thoughts on African trade?
Yeah, thanks, Glyn. And again, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I think going back to your original question about why is Africa trade lagging, I think it's a question of what does Africa mean. I think when you look at the African market in its aggregate as a whole, you actually miss a lot of the nuance of the market, a lot of the successes, a lot of the growth and the momentum that's actually happening here. Because, of course, there are more than 50 countries in this continent. There are a variety of regional partnerships, a variety of unique economies, multiple trade lanes to consider. And so we see some very strong signs of growth, and I'll give you 2 examples of that. First, from a trade and air cargo specific perspective, if you look at the Africa-East Asia trade flow, over the past decade, air cargo has been growing on this flow about 7% per year. That's the fastest of any major trade flow in the world. And that's an Africa trade flow, right? And we expect that that's going to continue in the next 20 years, that the volume on that flow is going to about triple in size. So there's another example of strong growth. I think, too, you look at the fundamentals of trade, what drives trade. One of those indicators is economic growth, GDP growth, which is a good indicator not just of economic production, but also of individual and household level income to consume goods, to drive import demand. And when you look at GDP growth, you see that 9 of the world's 20 fastest growing economies are actually in Africa today, right? That includes Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, just to name a few. And you look at the forecast for these countries, and they're also expected to be among the fastest growing in the next 5 or 10 years. And of course, as their economies grow, that's going to drive demand for trade. It's going to drive demand for air cargo. And so these are just some examples where when you break out the African market into its constituent parts, there's actually some very strong signs, I think, for growth. And I guess just also to the other part of the question of, well, what has been hampering growth? You can look at where some of these fast-growing economies, what they've been doing to help drive that and to increase their trade, and it's some of the things that you pointed out. So it's investing in physical infrastructure, roads, airports, ports, cold chain facilities to help get product to market. There's policy reforms, trade liberalization of traffic rights for connectivity, and there's also been economic diversification as well, as some of the other panelists have mentioned. Those are all important drivers, and we're seeing those play out in a positive way in some of these markets.
Excellent, thank you for that. I mean, that's been a really positive start because I think they're all achievable aspirations. You've not said anything that's not the impossible to attain. So I think it's really crucial, probably as an industry, that we try and educate the governments, because you guys work globally and internationally. You've seen success, you know the ingredients. So that's a really great start. So I have a second general question, then I'm going to go into specific questions, and I'm going to shake it up. So I'm actually going to do random, but this way, logically going through. So it's not that random, but my brain works in a certain way. So Aaron, first question to you is, we've talked about how we can expand African trade, what are the key things we have to address. Now let's bring it in closer to our industry. What do we have to do about the air cargo industry to address? Again, we attend a lot of conferences. We often hear the same sort of things. There's infrastructure challenges. We heard it during COVID, that there were only, I think, 4, maybe even 3 hub or gateways throughout the entire continent, which could take the temperature-sensitive vaccines that first came out. So that's often cited. Connectivity, political instability, or lack of open traffic. And I know there's a lot of initiatives underway to try and improve that. But what do you think we need to focus on to help the air cargo industry here? Starting, Aaron, as I say, going through.
Yeah, so looking forward for air cargo specifically, our World Air Cargo Forecast projects that African air cargo volumes will roughly double on the whole over the next 20 years, and that's going to be driven by a confluence of factors, some of which you've mentioned. There's going to be growth in economic fundamentals, so growth of GDP, growth of trade, policy reform. We've talked a bit about liberalization of traffic rights, liberalization of trade. And then you also need to look at some of the developments in the key market segments that air cargo is serving in Africa. That includes, just to name 2, perishable exports, not just to Europe, but also to other growing markets in the Middle East, for example, and also e-commerce from an inward demand perspective. And just to touch a minute on e-commerce, which has also been brought up a few minutes ago, this is a vast underserved market right now. So Africa accounts for 18% of the world's population, but last year just 0.5% of total global e-commerce revenues. And so there's vast potential to grow that market, to serve that market, and that's going to go a long way to generating demand for air cargo, at least on one of those key trade lanes coming in from East Asia.
So it's a case of demand's there, capacity will come. Infrastructure challenges will evaporate because there'll be the willing desire to do that. Great, excellent. Eric, your thoughts?
Yeah, Glenn, so I think speaking as a carrier, one of the things that we think about is our business as an operator is extremely asset intensive. It's very expensive. And so when you're a shipper and you look at who you need to use to get your goods to market, you look at dots on a map. And it's very expensive and difficult for an airline to serve every market. So taking a page of what Peter had just said in the first question, connectivity is very important. So if Qatar Airways is going to continue to serve primary markets on the continent, we do need to have help with partnerships to get secondary and tertiary markets connected. And so these are going to be very important because the goods that need to be moved in and out of a market aren't always produced where the airport is. And so you need to go into these secondary and tertiary markets. And to do that and to do it cost effectively, you need to have partnerships. And so I think that's an area where that Peter touched on. If we could have more of that, and we are actually looking at that as Qatar Airways with what we can do with partnerships here on the continent, that will further expand trade and provide more options for shippers as well as importers.
Excellent. I think that's the first time we've heard the word partnerships in the session, but I think that's very crucial and key. Yeah. I like that. Peter, your thoughts?
I would say, first of all, liberalization is critical. And I'll just give one example of a Kenya Airways success story in 2024. Leveraging on Saturn, leveraging on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area protocols. In 2024, we were able to transport over 400 tons of eggs from Lusaka to Entebbe. This is a first in the continent. Traditionally, you'd have to do a hop through Nairobi into Entebbe or take different routes. So I can see there are pockets of success around liberalization. We still have a number of markets that are very hardball. And I believe from a state level, the ratification of those SATM and Africa Continental Free Trade Area protocols, that will further accelerate how airlines can execute all these opportunities. Let me also say that we have some of the demand strongholds within the continent. We have a very unique challenge around repatriation of funds, blocked funds within the continent. And this is a big issue, and I want to really appreciate initiatives that are being run through AFRA and a number of stakeholders to unlock those challenges. Because you can imagine, you know, the aviation sector is very high capital, you know, investments, and if you cannot get your money out, it really creates a big issue. And this is one really, I would say, enabler of trade that needs to be, you know, followed through and released for all the players within the industry. I would say we talk of Africa population, 18%. I can tell you four of the highest populous countries in Africa have this problem. So you can see the correlation between demand and this particular challenge. So unless this is really released, then we run into a serious problem.
Great, and I think that comes back to something that's mentioned earlier about the need for political stability and interaction, but you also mentioned that we should promote much more the best case scenario, or the best practices, the things that go well. And I think we should also say that the AFRA, I don't know if anybody from AFRA is in the audience, but they're doing a fantastic job of trying to move a lot of these initiatives forwards, as is AFCAC in trying to get SATAM really embraced to try and create that openness. Wilson, what do you think we need to do here?
Sure, thanks, Glyn. Actually, as the panel goes on, I think I'm seeing the optimism and the commitment here, which is actually very, very pleasing. The challenges are not insurmountable, so actually it can be overcome. I like Eric mentioned about partnership earlier, but let me comment, I think, from a ground handler's perspective, first from a local aspect, and then taking it to international. At Hactl, we run an air cargo terminal. And I think a successful air cargo terminal, or we aspire to be one, of course, is to have the right infrastructure, i.e. both hardware and the software on the IT systems, and you also need the right kind of people. The people aspect we already talked about, which I fully agree. We have to get the younger generation excited about our industry, wanting to get into our industry, and get career progression in our industry. But I think there's no shortage of commitment when it comes to investing into the right infrastructure. And I think as the economies continue to improve, as the trade volume continues to pick up, the investment case will become more lucrative. So I think, you know, on that, in that sense, I'm actually very optimistic. I'm very, you know, bullish about potential in various African airports, which will then help handling the carriers as they expand the network. But I think the other aspect, taking it to the international level, is sharing of best practices. I think this is something which I think we all can do as a community together. I mean, granted, this is my first attendance in a conference in Africa. I'm very, you know, happy to be here, and I look forward to coming here more often. But I think this is something which international bodies such as IATA, but of course, Glyn, since you're here, maybe TIACA has even more roles to help to promote. Because the more cases that we can showcase. The great potential here is that the African economies can leapfrog. They do not need to start from scratch. There's so many done trial and tested cases which they can leapfrog into. And on that, therefore, I'm very optimistic.
Excellent. And as you say, success breeds success.
Yes.
Grant, what's your thoughts?
So you've had the input by Eric, and I agree with him. Coming from a Middle Eastern airline, our ambition to grow in Africa is quite great. But when it comes to aircraft delivery, and I know Aaron is sitting there, we all know it takes its time. And look, my ambition for Africa is to give as much capacity to everyone, right? And my focus is to grow Africa for Etihad, but also for the region, because it's part of my heart. And I know the question's coming later, Etihad's expanding, but I do want to focus on secondary airports, and yes, we're going to touch on infrastructure, but I feel that if we're going to move perishables or pharma or a global aspect to grow cargo, air freight specifically, we need to focus on secondary airports. I mean, who knows? Etihad might announce Mombasa soon. How are we going to get into Mombasa? The fact is, Harare for this time, we're focusing on that. And this is where I find us as airlines, and I think Eric and that will agree, Africa is one of those continents where you have to constantly strategize weekly or monthly to find those little niche pockets to say, okay, right now we're going to fly in for this season, but do we have the capacity? Does it make financial sense? What David said. So this is our main focus for Africa is we've got the Far East locked down. We've got Europe locked down. America, God forbid that orange band doesn't do anything, but inshallah, we'll try our best to look after it. But Africa is a continent where there's a constant need for focus. And from an airline, that is how we do it. The only issue, and I take it back, is government's willingness to work with the ambitions of what we want to do as an airline. And that's where it slips and slides, where it drags on, where those niche pockets that we've identified fall away. And then they source from other continents to find their manufacturing or their raw materials. And this is where we need to start identifying and working closer with government to be that speediness. We don't work in sea freight, we work in air freight. We need to send the stuff tomorrow. And this is what we need to sell.
And I think that's crucial because, again, when governments look at transport modes, and we all support, we need a good, robust maritime industry, but true economic prosperity comes from what they send via air. Air, on average, is worth 181 times more value per kilo than cargo that moves on maritime. So it's the air cargo products that you guys move and handle, which is where prosperity comes from. So great. So Racheal, what's your thoughts?
Eric did talk about partnerships, but I would like to look at it from a ground handler perspective. So it is partnering with the airports, with the governments, in building fit-for-purpose facilities, whether it's the warehouses that caters for the perishables or pharmaceutical centers, and not just the brick and mortar, but over and above that, it's investment in the processes. How can we bring in the global standards, localize them, and give this to the market? And also investing in our people, because the people will breathe into the facilities, into the processes, that at least then we can work together. But I said partnership. But driving that further is then collaboration. We can't do this alone. I think we did talk about the challenges, why we're not where we are. And I think this we're looking at the cargo communities, having a shared voice. So having a shared voice to be able to push the agenda in the right spaces. That is quite critical. Because as I said, we know the solutions, but then we need to see how do we move together We have to collaborate, we have to cooperate.
Excellent. And Racheal, I think you have a long political career ahead of you, actually. Some of the things you say, no, really very powerful. They're talking about shared voice. And I know the work you do with young people, which we're going to come up later on, is crucial. So excellent, another really excellent round. Now I'm going to go into some specific questions. My random brain is now going to start from this end again and go forward one by one. But it's a specific question. Now, Aaron, we've heard a lot about notion of capacity. You guys do a lot of forecast, you look at markets, etc. What is your forecast for capacity here from the freighter perspective, for example?
Yep, so the demand is going to drive need for additional dedicated freighter lift. And we're forecasting in the next 20 years for the African market, for African domiciled carriers in particular, the need for about 100 additional net aircraft to grow the fleet. So to put that in context, that means growing African fleets from about 60 in-service aircraft today to more than 150 by the early 2040s. That's overall an underestimate of the number of aircraft that are going to be needed to serve this market, though, right? Because there's additional demand for freighters from operators based elsewhere in the Middle East, in Europe, in Asia, who are serving this market as well. So there's going to be some additional freighters going there. And then also for the African market, you need to look at replacement demand as well. The African fleet, a lot of it is getting quite old. In particular, there are a number of 737 classic freighters with an average age well over 30 years old. There's some 727s flying around. Their average age over 40. Some of them are pushing 50 years old. So those aircraft are also going to need to be replaced by newer, more capable, and more efficient aircraft in the near to medium term as well. And that's where the 737 BCF, of course, comes in as the industry's most reliable and most efficient standard body freighter. So strong demand for aircraft in this market, a mixture of fleet growth with about 100 more airplanes and then a number of replacement demand as well, fleet renewal.
Excellent, and that's a really, I know you do a lot of research, so that's actually very interesting to watch. Just one thing I have to pick you up, you're saying somebody in their 50s is old? Is that what you're saying?
You call me young?
Okay, what about approaching as they get to 60? You just don't have anything that old in the sky anymore.
Okay.
Well aged. So Eric, I did a quick check, and I may be wrong, but I think you've got about 180 weekly flights in the continent. Where are you, I mean, that's phenomenal. You probably cover most of the continent, but where are you seeing most of the growth or growth and expansion? Is it pockets or general?
It's in general, it's overall. We have 28 cities that we serve with passenger combination bellies, and then we have 4 markets that are dedicated with freighters. And overall, when we look at the market and how it shaped up in 24, it was a good year for us. The markets were strong. What in particular we like about it is they're balanced markets. So we often struggle on the operator side to have flows into a market, but maybe they don't come out. And that's not the case with Qatar Airways in Africa. We have fairly equal flows inbound and outbound. That's attractive for us. And I think overall we're seeing just growth in general from everywhere. I mean, one of the things that I noticed as a new resident in Doha is that Africa really is a breadbasket of the Mideast and of Europe. I can't tell you the number of times I would go into a Monoprix or a Carrefour and they post flags of the countries where the produce comes from. And much of what my family consumes is grown here in the continent. The quality is good, it tastes is delicious, it's reasonably priced, and in good shape. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for Africa to continue along those lines and keep producing and keep exporting, and yet they consume as well, and so you have raw materials even coming in, or finished products being imported in. So we're seeing overall continued growth of our strong markets continuing, and for that reason, we remain very positive and optimistic about the market.
Excellent, great. Now, I'm going to take that theme, Peter, and say to you, because we had last week Valentine's Day, and in the 2-3 weeks running up to that, millions of beautiful, fresh, naturally grown flowers from here, from maybe in Ethiopia as well, effectively impacted billions of people's lives. Very rare that we can actually say on one given day, billions of lives were impacted positively because of things that flew via air cargo. Now, I have to, in full transparency, I forgot Valentine's Day. So divorce proceedings commenced apparently yesterday, so I won't forget next year. But Peter, how was this year for flower traffic?
I'll speak first from the airline capacity side. In Q4 2024, the Kenyan horticultural industry was on its knees. We had about close to 1,000 tons of capacity withdrawn from this market. A lot of the freighters operating within our jurisdiction had to, fly into Asia for the e-commerce business. So one of the big challenges that the industry here faces is this instability of capacity. And luckily, Valentine's 2025 happened same time with the Chinese New Year. So the freighters had no e-commerce, so they had to jump into Kenya. And I must say, the first quarter so far has been fantastic. Capacity-wise was excellent. Production-wise, we had a bit of rain, I think 2 weeks just ahead of Valentine's, which really reduced the production level. But overall, so far the quarter has been immensely successful. Coming into the upcoming International Women's Day, I can see, I have the privilege to also serve in one of the Kenya Airways subsidiary, FFF, and we have volumes of flowers. Yesterday we had rollovers of 100 tons of flowers onto the International Women's Day demand, which is looking up. But I must say that the consistency of capacity is fundamental to the growth of the air cargo industry in Africa. Africa gets a lot of the knee-jerk effects. Whenever freighters are, checking where to operate. This is why my CEO, Mr. Kilavuka, earlier this morning mentioned that Kenya Airways is very intentional in getting into the wide-body freighter operations. This is part of the strategy to anchor a particular quantum of the horticultural industry here with the national carrier, because that base is actually guaranteed for the operators here.